Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best cards in Knights of the Frozen Throne. And when I say best cards, what I mean by that are the cards that have been the most influential, the most popular, the most played cards, specifically in constructed standard format. So I'm not talking about arena cards, I'm not talking about wild format. And to help me determine this list, I did actually consult some data on hsreplay.net to see which cards were the most popular, which cards had the highest win rate, collected all of those, and then used a little bit of judgment on my part to rank them in a specific order. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into this top 10 list of the best cards in Knights of the Frozen Throne. Up first, we have Crypt Lord, the Druid card, and of course, this will not be the last Druid card you see on this list, but Crypt Lord makes the cut here because of its influence in token Druid specifically. Turns out having a huge taunt minion like this for only 3 mana that gets bigger with the more minions you play, guess what? That fits token Druid's playstyle perfectly because they like to summon a lot of minions, and this works really well with buffs as well, protecting some of those other valuable assets on the board, allowing token Druid to build really big stuff that their opponent can't push through because cards like Crypt Lord protect all of those smaller minions. So great fit for Druid. It actually can be played outside of token Druid too, just because it's a lot of health and a lot of body for a 3 mana taunt, making it a great defensive asset in any other decks that just need some extra defense or want to utilize taunt synergies, in particular with things like mid-range taunt Druid that we've also seen pop up in Knights of the Frozen Throne, making this a really versatile and incredibly powerful card. Up next at the number 9 spot is the 9 mana Obsidian statue for Priest. This is a guy that has a ton of different keywords on its card. It's taunt, it's lifesteal, and of course that incredible death rattle where you get to destroy an enemy minion. So there's a lot to like about this card, and Priest has certainly found ways to utilize this. Most notably in Big Priest is a card that gets pulled out of barns and gets resummoned with Eternal Servitude and gets summoned with Shadow Essence. There's all kinds of different ways for this guy to show up in that deck. But even Rozakis-style Highlander Priests are also running one-ofs for Obsidian statues sometimes, just because the card has so much raw value and it's so difficult for people to deal with efficiently because it ends up either giving you a ton of health or killing something valuable of your opponents, or just being a taunt that they can't quite push through. So surprisingly, a card that's actually worked in multiple decks for Priest, and of course Priest right now is very, very powerful in the Knights of the Frozen Throne standard format meta, so this card has earned its spot on the list. Moving on to the number 8 spot, we have Skulking Geist, and although not a Druid card, it's certainly a card that's only on this list because of Druid. If you look at the number, Skulking Geist is one of the most played cards in Frozen Throne because it is the tech card of choice to answer Jade Druid specifically, and all those Jade idols they like to shuffle into their deck. So this essentially becomes the only way for other control or other slow decks to actually combat the infinite resources that Jade Druid has access to. So any deck that's looking to go to fatigue or looking to have enough removal to deal with all those Jades, this essentially puts a cap on how big those Jades can get and gives those decks some extra way to deal with Jade Druid and the powerful influence it has on the ladder. So Skulking Geist might lose popularity as Jade Druid falls out of popularity, but for now it has been a very influential part of Hearthstone. Now on to the number 7 spot, we have the Paladin card, Righteous Protector. This is one that I actually predicted would be the best card in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and although it's not quite that good, it has still made a pretty solid impact in Paladin, and Paladin has been a popular class in the Knights of the Frozen Throne meta with things like Murloc Paladin, a little bit of Control Paladin, and even Hand Buff Paladin, a deck I've been playing a lot of. Righteous Protector works really well across all those archetypes. It has both defensive utility as a card that slows down early aggressive decks, but it also works well in aggressive decks itself, just because it's a minion that's hard for your opponents to deal with. It has some synergies with cards like Rallying Blade, and any other buff cards like Blessing of Kings or Bone Mare, for instance, really utilize this card nicely, so it ends up being a really versatile and strong early game card for a class that right now is quite strong itself. And then up next at the number 6 spot, we actually have another Druid card, and I'll warn you now, it's certainly not going to be the last Druid card on this list, but this is Malfurion the Pestilent, the Druid Death Knight, and although it doesn't look like Malfurion the Pestilent is himself the strongest of Death Knights, he is one of the best simply because he's a Druid card. And often when you play Malfurion the Pestilent, that is a signal that the game is over. Aggressive decks simply can't handle the swing turn of Malfurion the Pestilent, especially if he's innervated out on turn 5, for instance, just because that 5 armor, the 2 1/5 taunts, and the ability to continue to gain armor via your hero power for the rest of the game is often just too much for aggressive decks to handle, and Malfurion the Pestilent has probably caused a lot of insta-concedes. I know I've often encountered him and considered the game over exactly at that point. But, even if you're not playing against aggressive decks, there's still a lot of value in both his defensive and offensive hero powers. That flexibility gives Malfurion the Pestilent the ability to clear minions from time to time, to tank up, and occasionally even those 2 poisonous spiders come out and cause a lot of friction for your opponents as well. So this ends up being a card that makes a ton of sense in Jade Druid. Any other defensive Druid deck, it's a little too slow for Token Druid, admittedly, but it's so dominant in the most dominant form of Druid, which is Jade, that Malfurion the Pestilent has quite easily carved out a spot on this list as one of only actually 2 Death Knight cards that do make the cut. Spoiler alert. But Malfurion the Pestilent is the Druid one, and of course has earned his spot here. And then up next at the number 5 spot, of course, it's another Druid card. This time around, the 5 mana Spreading Plague. Now, you'll note that at the time this video is released, Spreading Plague has not yet been nerfed, but will soon be nerfed to 6 mana. I did want to capture Spreading Plague's original iteration here simply because this is the one that has been so dominant in the first month of Knights of the Frozen Throne. I guess time will tell if it remains dominant at 6 mana. I think it will still be a very strong card, but as it stands at 5 mana, Spreading Plague is another incredible swing card, much like Malfurion the Pestilent behind it, that just provides so much defensive utility to the Druid that it shuts out aggressive decks. Even control decks can be frustrated by this card because it simply slows them down so much that it allows Druid to build a giant wall of Jade Golems right behind all these little taunts that get in your way. So one of the most oppressive and one of the most frustrating cards in Frozen Throne, certainly one of the most played and most influential in the set as well. Spreading Plague is everybody's nightmare, and it's one of the cards that's so darn good that Blizzard decided they had to, in fact, nerf it, so it should be no doubt that it deserves a spot on this list. And then we'll move on to the number 4 spot. It is the big bad guy himself. It is the Lich King. You'll note that so far only 2 neutral cards have been on this list, the Lich King being the second, and in fact only 1 more neutral card is going to be on this list. Another little spoiler there. But for the Lich King, it shouldn't be too surprising. This was sort of the central villain of the entire expansion, the guy everybody knows and loves, or at least the character everybody knows and loves. And, it's one of those just general use legendary minions in Hearthstone that you expect a lot of different decks to find some value in, and Lich King has actually exceeded my expectations for the card. It's being played considerably more than I ever thought it would. In the first week of the expansion, it was played a ton. It has lost a little steam over time. It's less popular, but it's still a good fit for virtually any control deck. It just adds enough value, enough defensive power, and sometimes those Death Knight cards really high roll and do amazing things for you and can win games on their own. So having that potential as a card in your list goes a really long way, and that's why the Lich King fits into so many different decks, and he's one of the most played cards in the expansion and one of the most important and powerful neutral cards of the expansion as well. So no surprise to see Arthas himself right here on this list. And now as we move into the top 3, we have the other Death Knight hero card on this list. This one is Shadow Reaper Anduin for Priest, which of course is the primary driving force behind the new Rozakis Priest deck that is a very high tier deck right now and looks like it might become an even more oppressive and popular and powerful deck as the new nerfs start to roll into the meta, because it looks like Raza Priest is one of the few things that won't be touched by the incoming nerfs, so I expect even more great things to come from Shadow Reaper Anduin. But when you get that free 0 mana, 2 damage hero power that continues to cycle itself every time you play a card, that is incredibly stupidly good and clearly good enough to win games. Attach that to Anduin's Battle Cry here that destroys all minions with 5 or more attack, and suddenly you have a very swingy kind of card that puts the deck in positions to win anytime it unlocks that exact combo with Raza. When you pile on other things like Prophet Velen, for instance, it just starts to spiral out of control, and you can see why Shadow Reaper Anduin is, in my opinion, the most powerful of all the Death Knight hero cards. Certainly the one that has carved out a spot in the meta the most for himself, because he's created basically a tier 1 deck, all just because he exists So deserving of the top 3 spot here, I think. And as the expansion wears on, I hope he doesn't become too problematic like many of the Druid cards on this list. Speaking of problematic Druid cards, the number 2 spot belongs to Ultimate Infestation. What can you really even say about this card? It does absolutely everything, and it gives Druids the ultimate tool, pun intended, ultimate tool for their entire game plan, which is ramping tons of mana, sacrificing card advantage along the way, and then suddenly you give them a perfect out with a card that rewards all of that ramping with additional cards, which removes all of the risk of ramp in the first place. Not to mention it also builds the board and serves as removal, and even gives them some armor. It's perfect for what Druid's game plan is all about. It's too good for what Druid's game plan is all about because it removes all of the downside and provides just so much ridiculous upside in the meantime. Ultimate Infestation probably should have been nerfed alongside Spreading Plague and Innervate. Hopefully those nerfs are enough to keep this card in check. But clearly over the course of the first month of the expansion, this has been probably the most talked about, most hated, most problematic card in a vast majority of the Hearthstone community's eyes. And I personally have to agree. That said, I don't actually think it's been the best Knights of the Frozen Throne card. I think that honor belongs to one other card. And that card, believe it or not, is Bone Mare. I am stunned that I put this card at number 1, but when you look at the stats for cards that are being played the most, Bone Mare has earned this right. He deserves the number 1 spot because everybody's playing Bone Mare. This card is being played in aggressive decks as the top end of their curve that just piles on a ton of damage and an additional body that opponents can't deal with because they've been bracing to keep up with an aggro start anyway. It's being played in mid-range decks, of course, because it's a perfect kind of mid-range minion. It's being played in control decks because it turns out giving something +4/+4 and taunt is a great defensive utility as well. This is a surprisingly flexible card. It has an immediate impact on the board. It's a pile of stats for its cost. It's got some taunt for extra utility. Bone Mare basically does everything, and basically everybody is finding an excuse to play this card. It's the most popular card in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and one of the few neutral cards that's actually being played a ton across the meta. We've only seen a couple others on this list with the Lich King and Skulking Geist, but who knew that the one neutral common card that's a 7-mana minion would be so popular? That's a rare thing to see in Hearthstone. Usually it's not common cards, it's not neutral common cards in particular, and it's usually not 7-mana cards that become popular across multiple archetypes and multiple decks. So Bone Mare is really, really surprising to me in a lot of ways. It looked like a very good card coming into the expansion. I never expected it to be the absolute best card in the entire expansion. And there you have it. That's my list of the 10 best Knights of the Frozen Throne cards. I'm sure some of these are going to be up for debate. I'm sure a lot of you think I got at least some of the ordering wrong. I'm sure you think I got some of the cards wrong as well. Well, guess what? I'd love to hear your take. What's your opinion? What cards belonged on this list? What order should they have been in? What's your top card? Heck, what's the worst card in Knights of the Frozen Throne? I'd like to hear all of those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.